يا لغتي عربية حسبي بأنك منطقي وبياني عربية قلبي.
Now, the crucial bit here, therefore, whoever breaks one of these commandments, so let's take a random commandment, what should we say? The food laws.
Right.
Okay.
Acid test.
An acid test. What did Paul teach about the food laws? But come on, let's see what Paul in Ephesians says about the law. Remember, Jesus says, I do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Paul says, Jesus has abolished the law with its commandments and his ordinances. This is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15. This is not a mere question of a different context. Otherwise, night is day and day is night, and the devil is God and God is the devil. You know, these are polar opposites.
Okay. Can I just
absolute
can I comment
opposites.
on that?
You cannot spin that to
Okay.
be
No, I'm not, I won't do that.
No,
but I'm
but
just saying, in that context, you have to then say you brought food laws in. If you read the whole chapter, is that referring to food laws, or is that referring to what he's saying prior when he's speaking about the Beatitudes, when he's speaking about those sort of things? So I'm saying it seems like you're
mention the food. I'm simply saying as an example of the least of these commandments.
Yes, but scholars would actually say when that terminology is utilised about fulfilling, and when he's actually talking about the law, he's saying I've come to correctly interpret the Torah, not to misinterpret it.
I agree. In terms of the rule of love.
Yes, so correctly interpret the Torah. And so when we're looking at that in context, it's saying, well, this is the correct interpretation of the Torah, doing this, doing that, and that's why I've not come to do away with this.
Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments.
These commandments, yes, context there. No. What the commandments he's
talking about abolishing the law of the prophets. He's talking about the Torah here.
But
if you look at contemporary commentaries, Dale Allison, Jimmy Dunstanton, I haven't come across a single modern scholar that I've read, but presumably there are, who says this is not to do with the Torah. This is to do with the Torah. Now, the Lutheran understanding would say, well, it's a different subject.
Yeah.
If we talk about the great evangelical Christian scholars that you know about and I know about, they will always say this refers to the Torah. I refer you to Dale Allison's the classic commentary on Matthew, authored by Dale Allison.
Okay, no, I haven't read that one. But
he talks about the various possible interpretations.
So he's a very good scholar,
yeah, he comes to the conclusion convincingly that this is talking about the law. If you wanted confirmation of that, it's quite simple to go to Matthew 23, where it's unambiguous. Jesus says, it's the end of Jesus' ministry, he's teaching the crowds and his disciples. He says this: the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. In other words, they teach the law. We all agree with that? Sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach. In other words, they're hypocrites. But nevertheless, in their role as teachers of the law, you must do whatever they do and follow it. Interestingly, and this is a sub footnote here, if the Pharisees, who teachers of the law, tell you to execute a homosexual, an apostate, an adulterer, as mandated in the law, you would have to do it, according to teaching of Jesus. Now you would say, well, what about in John's Gospel where it says about the woman caught in adultery? Well, that passage, as we know, is not found in the Bible. It is a later, as you know, this is a later insertion. And in fact, there's a footnote here that says that no early manuscript has this story. But it's still kept in the Bible. Why? Because it's a lovely story. Even though there's no historical evidence that Jesus said it, or did it. It's a complete, it came centuries later. None of the early fathers know of this story. Yeah. So that's a red herring, put that to one side. So, in a sense, to use highly controversial and regrettable language, I'm going to regret saying this, Jesus is more like ISIS than he is the modern Christian. Because what I mean is, it is a problematic thing to say, but what I mean is, he is someone who would endorse the death penalty for apostasy, for homosexual acts, for adultery, for bestiality, in fact, for the dozens and dozens of commandments of the God. That sounds, I know it's it's a shock question just to get you to think. But it's not like a modern Jesus.
Just stirring back to the point I was trying to say, because you were saying about James first, and then you were saying James had more of a pure message. How you doing, Richard? He can always do a lot better job than me.
He's a Tom Wright fan. I said you were a Richard Borden fan, so you might want to argue about it. Tom Wright, you guys Tom Wright. But not too much.
How sort of you were playing off James with Pauline Gospel?
Yes, absolutely.
That sort of message.
Definitely is a key.
But then I was saying let's look at then the Petrine Gospel. Because if the Petrine Gospel was simply about the law, why is it then when people say, what should we do? He says, repent and be baptized. Why isn't he saying, keep the law?
Do you want me to answer that?
Okay, but can I read out?
No, read out, because there's an obvious answer to this. But
Yes.
just
So I mean, okay, I won't read the whole sermon.
So he's saying, he's
Yes.
quoting the book of Acts, where Peter is presented as preaching a gospel, which sounds remarkably similar to Paul's gospel. And I agree, it does. But do you want to read it, and then I'll explain to you the problems with it?
Peter, context, he sort of goes through the resurrection and sort of things. Jesus was resurrected, and then he goes into this is Acts 2:38. Oh wait, let me stop for it. They said, now when they heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, brothers, what shall we do? And Peter said to them, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. Okay, then said, for this promise is for you and for your children. So why isn't he saying here, if it's about law abiding and law keeping, and if it's sort of this, Jamesian, I don't know if that's the correct term, the Jamesian gospel, okay, is that keeping the law? Why isn't Peter at the beginning of the ministry, prior even to Paul becoming a convert, why isn't he saying that? But he's saying something that's very similar to the Pauline message.
There's a very, very straightforward answer.
Yes.
But just before I give that answer, I just want to mention one. Even in Acts, James is still the head of the church. He is still a Torah-observant Jew. He still issues decrees to the Gentiles to follow certain laws, which Paul ignores in all of his letters.
No, so I'm not having a problem with them keeping the law. I believe Peter kept the law as well.
So the head
but
of
it wasn't.
Okay.
Yes.
So my central thesis of we're talking about James here and the church. James is the head of the church, the first pope, if you like, is still a Jew following Judaism, teaching Judaism to Jews. The question is, on what terms do we allow the Gentiles into this movement? That's the issue. It's not the nature of the movement. The nature remains Judaism. It's not Christianity.
But if that was then Peter here, his audience wasn't Gentile.
Now I come to Peter.
So,
I just want to establish that point, because this is so well attested historically in multiple independent sources that are not Christian, like Josephus, who's a contemporary of Jesus and Peter in Jerusalem. He's come from Jerusalem. He's a historian. We have his works today. We can read them. And other people like Eusebius and Hesychus, the 2nd century Jewish bishop. So for me, that point remains unassailed. So originally, there was no Christianity, it was Judaism. Coming to Peter, there's a problem with Acts, and I'm sure you know this, that scholars have noticed for a long time. When you look at Paul's preaching in Acts about the gospel message, and then you compare it to Paul's uncontested authentic letters, Romans 1 and 2, Corinthians, Galatians, the uncontested letters, they don't match. They're not the same gospel. They're quite different. And this is odd, because Luke is supposed to be a companion of Paul. How come he doesn't understand Paul? How come he doesn't understand what Paul's preaching is? And there have been various theories to account for this. One is that, in fact, Luke isn't the author of Acts, that he's not a companion of Paul, and that it's written in the early 2nd century. And a number of scholars, including Bart Ehrman, who think this today.
So that must be early 2nd century.
Yes. But the dating is not the point here. The point is that how do we account for the differences between Paul's preaching to the Gentiles in Acts and in his undisputed letters? Because they're quite different. Paul says different things. There's also a difficult historical point to make here about the nature of historiography, history writing in the ancient world. It was a convention in the ancient world, right from Thucydides, the father of history, onwards, that if you weren't present at an event, a public event, like today, and you were writing about an event, you could quite legitimately put words in people's mouths. You can invent speeches, basically, in accordance with the kind of thing that they would have said on that occasion had you been there to witness it. That's pretty much a paraphrase of Thucydides. He talks about this, because he talks about battles in ancient Greece, and he has generals giving speeches. He wasn't there, but he admits, the events happened, but he didn't make up the events. But so he puts these wonderful speeches in these people's mouths, freely admitting that they are free creations. Now this is a really important point to make, because if Luke is right, Luke was not witnessing, was not present at, say, Pentecost. There's no evidence that he was present. He was a Gentile for a start. He wasn't there at the beginning. If he is writing, say, 50 years after the event, towards the end of the 1st century, if he followed the conventions of the time, he would have freely composed speeches and put them in the mouths of people in accordance with what he thought they would have said on that occasion. That's how they did history in those days. There were no tape recorders. There were no iPhones.
But wouldn't that be...
Just to finish off, this is accepted by virtually everyone. The people like F.F. Bruce, the evangelical, this is not a controversial point, but it's not widely known by ordinary Christians who don't know this. If you study this at university, you study the nature of the historical documents, you are faced with the uncomfortable fact that a lot of these speeches are put in the mouths of people like Peter and Paul.
Wouldn't that be presupposing?
Did you know that, by the way?
No. So I've heard.
Were you aware of this?
Yeah, no. I was. Yeah. So
I'm doing a PhD in this.
No. So I've read it. I've read it more in popular works like Parham and things like that. But no, good to see you. Thank you.
But I'm talking about specialists in Acts itself. The historians who are specialists in Acts. The consensus is that Luke wasn't there. Following the conventions of his day, he would have put these speeches in the mouth. So what we are reading, when we read Peter, when we read Paul, and we can be nowhere with Paul because it's not the same as the letters, we are reading what Luke thought Peter would have said.
Wouldn't that be presupposing that this isn't based on eyewitness testimony? And so people like Borkham who have argued...
So was Luke an eyewitness testimony?
So one second. It depends how he collected the eyewitnesses' testimony. So even if he wasn't there, okay, he could have easily gone and collected the eyewitness testimony of people who were...
Oh, 50 years after the event.
So who were... Well, it depends how... Yes. So,
yeah, seriously, Acts is usually written... Luke Acts is usually written 80, 85 AD. 50 years after.
Can I say a point, please? So... It's presupposing that when Luke was collecting his was writing his Gospels, that they were definitely not based on any eyewitness testimony at all. But people like Borkham will argue that a lot of Luke's writings were based on, let's say, could have been the women disciples, could have been based on eyewitnesses who were there at those events.
As chapter 1, verse 1.
Yes, as he.
I forgot you were there, Richard.
Yes.
Please come in.
Now, as he does introduce, so the same way that we hold to Luke being written that way, and as he puts in his declaration, I can't remember who he was writing to. I can't remember who it was.
It was on that page.
Yeah, Theophilus. That's it. Sorry. So yeah, in as much as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just of those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, you may have certainly concerning things you have been taught. And I think the presupposition that you've made then, I think which Ehrman's...
Not my presupposition.
No.
This is what your own historian.
But you were saying it's a consensus, and so people like Borkham who have been writing on the reliability.
Oxford say this is simple.
Yeah, no. So I'm saying it can't just be brushed. It can't just be sort of generalised and said this. The whole of scholarship is saying this.
No, I'm not saying the whole.
So, I mean, to say a consensus...
A consensus is not 100% by definition. Okay. It means a general view.
Okay.
Always dissensus.
Yes. So I think I would happily take the Borkham's point and say that he could have easily taken these sermon summaries of Peter from him compiling his gospel accounts and interviewing Peter.
And I mean, there's a general issue here, which is above my pay grade, which is, how did the early church transmit material? Were they careful about it? Were they careful about the sayings of Jesus? Which model are we using? Are we using those of the old kind of tradition criticism? Are we using those of modern folklore in different Aboriginal societies? Are we using a Jewish model? Are we following Samuel Bierskov? Are we following that other chap who lives in the Middle East in the modern Kenneth Bailey? There are all these kinds of models which to different extents believe that the Christian community would have actually preserved tradition. I think that whichever model, I generally was more persuaded of Richard Borkham's work by the more conservative scholars. I thought he put forward a good case for those. I think within the New Testament, Paul has some very interesting things, using some more rabbinical language about paradidomi, paradosis, tradition. What I received, I passed on to you. I would say, with my 2 cents, the broad evidence I see from the early Christian community in that first century is they were quite conservative on material. This doesn't prove that the speeches in Acts weren't made up in the style of Thucydides or whichever gentleman it was. But there are at least other options, which is maybe they are working on preserved orally written tradition. He says he's using written material before. Yeah, I just think there's lots of options on the table.
I'm not so sanguine as you about the options. I think there are insurmountable factual differences which narrow our options down radically. I don't know if you heard. It's going to turn into an academic classroom if we're not careful. But if you go through the speeches of Paul in Acts, where he talks about salvation, talks about the Gentiles, how they know God, and so on, what must they do to be saved? You compare that with Paul's letters, say Romans and so on. It appears that that Paul is a different person. He's not speaking the same gospel message. There's quite a different gospel message, and this is something that scholars had to try and explain. Why is the Paul of Acts so different from the Paul of his letters, prophetic letters, in terms of his theology? His soteriology is quite different. And again, we'd have to go through this in a classroom setting. But this, I've seen the evidence, it's well known. And yeah, if you look here, Paul in Romans says this, and Acts he says something quite different. And it's not just context that does this. We're dealing with a different theology here about who Jesus, his role in salvation, about how the Gentiles is to be understood. So we automatically have problems, whatever options, when we go through these options, we need to just look at the ground here. Now, if Luke is dated, as it usually is, and again this assumption which you may challenge, if he's dated towards the end of the 1st century, 80-85, for the Gospel, and thereby Acts immediately afterwards, the events he's talking about start in AD 30, AD 33, 50 years afterwards. In those days, again, this is a disputed point, but there seems to be a general view that the main way the Christian message was transmitted was orally, through word of mouth. Yeah, it wasn't done by people with textbooks or iPhones or recorders or anything like that. Now, I know in the Gospel of Luke he uses Mark, so he's using an earlier source, and he's using probably what was called Quail, this other source, in addition to Mark. So he's using sources. But Acts is unique. I mean, we don't have any other parallel Acts we can compare it to.
Although we know that history is cruel to manuscripts.
I love it. So when we look at Acts, we're looking at speeches that are allegedly made about 50 years or so before, that would have been transmitted orally, very likely, over the generation, over the decades, in the context of how Luke is probably the best historian in the Bible. I mean, he really is an historian. He's not some kind of lay chap who's just writing old stuff. He has the gravitas, he has the methodology of an historian. If you look at how history was written in the ancient world, the conventions of the best Greek scholarship, when it came to speeches, they didn't have verbatim records. They tended to make things up, but not in a free way, but in accordance with what the people would have said on that occasion that was suitable. Now, this isn't just Acts, by the way. You talk about Richard Balcombe, and Richard Balcombe and F. Bruce make a similar point about John's Gospel. And in fact, F. Bruce, the great evangelical, he says that John's Jesus, the words attributed to Jesus in John are free creations. The word free creations is used by F. Bruce. Because for all similar sorts of reasons we're going to go into. So I think our starting assumption that Luke as an historian is like a modern biography of David Beckham or a chronicle of the Second World War, where you have a whole bunch of testimony, you have documents, you have footage and all that, is mistaken.
But I mean, so with John, I'm still making up my mind about John, but I'm very open to the idea that yes, there are free creations in John, and that could explain why they're so different from the Synoptic Gospels. But it's not just John. As I mentioned earlier, there's Paul and the way he seems to very seriously and actually conservatively treat the material about Jesus. And it's often been, well, I say often, conservative scholars at least do make a point about how the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels in many ways doesn't actually seem like it's being altered to suit later Christians, even though it would be nice to do so. For example, I mean, where does Jesus, talk about the issue of Gentiles coming to church? Doesn't really deal with it as much. It touches, I do believe it teaches his divinity, sacrificial death, not as much as Christians might like. There are issues that there were issues that the early church was grappling with, yet apart from perhaps John, they did actually not see fit to project back into the past. So yes, there's the model of John.
You make a good point. You make a good point there.
But there are other models, I'd say actually probably more models in the New Testament which actually have a very conservative model. So that's why I say many options, I think, are on the table.
Sorry, can I go hit and run as well? Go to the toilet somewhere. But can I just say that
Literally over there. No, that's
but if there was sort of an evolution in Paul's thought, isn't it quite strange that, or the texts themselves, the dating of the texts, that Paul's writings well before, if things were dusted up, why were they sort of dusted up in that manner? That Paul was very liberal, obviously in his texts that were a lot earlier than the Lucan texts, which are a lot later.
You're assuming a canon, a discrete canon like the
No,
Bible?
no, obviously not. I'm saying if there was this, because I normally see that there's this evolution. We have it a lot with the divinity of Christ. People say, you know, you have the evolution.
We see it in the
Okay, obviously I'll disagree, and Richard will disagree with you on that
According
point.
to what you said, Luke,
Yes.
so really we get Paul, which is high Christology, then Mark, which is lower Christology, then he said Matthew is a higher Christology, but then Luke is a lower Christology. He's all over the place.
Sorry guys, before you, no, I just need to, does anyone know where the toilet is near here?
Yeah, in the centre of the park.
What?
There's a toilet. I don't know if it's supposed to. It's actually one.
You need a key to get in, but you need... Right.
Do you need a key?
Yeah, you need a key.
Oh, look.
Just hobble a bit as you go in.
Guys, I will pop back to the minute. Thank you. Good speaking to you, as always.
Just come back. I think we do see many examples of an evolving and developing Christology between the Gospels. So the lower Christology of Mark is elevated in Matthew and Luke and John. And there are many examples where we can see how Matthew and Luke have changed the words, changed the stories in Mark, and have elevated the status of Jesus, the way he's spoken about. So, although Paul is earlier and has a high Christology, there are multiple streams in the early church.
Yes.
It's not just like a single stream, yeah? So the Gospels, the Synoptics do their own thing, independently of Paul, in terms of Christological discussions. So we see, for example, there are many. Do you want examples of how Matthew sets up Jesus?
I think we've talked about examples before, and I will agree that there are cases where, at least I think I agree, I'd have to check in specific cases. Actually, give me some examples.
Okay. Let's make a more, perhaps a lesser known, more general point. That in Mark, the disciples of Jesus generally have a bad press. They're hard of heart, they don't understand, they just don't get it. Sheikh Nazam has arrived. Talking about your favourite subject. Yeah. Exactly, we are. And a paradigmatic example of that for me is the Jesus walking on water, stilling the storm, disciples hard of heart, they don't believe, end of story. Yeah. The same event, same story in Matthew's Gospel. We can look at it. The negativity is removed, and they worship Jesus. So these are isolated stories. They typify, exemplify gospel-wide changes from Mark to Matthew. I give that one as a very well-known example of how Matthew plays fast and loose with history to make a theological point about the role model, the disciples' role modelling, if you like, for us as readers of what it is to be a good Christian. So here we have theology, which is overlaying history, assuming Mark is history.
So I mean, I'm very happy to say.
Do you agree with that, or should we look at the passage?
There are places to that. The one with the disciples bowing down, worshipping Jesus. Yes, that is a case where Matthew does seem to have a higher Christology than Mark. So I'm happy to concede that. On that point, though, I'd say the evidence that there are cases like that. So there's that case, and then there will be other cases where Matthew and Luke kind of elevate what Mark has. But at the same time, there's at least one example I can think of where it seems like Mark's actually got a bit of a higher Christology. His confession before the high priest in Mark's Gospel is, I am, you'll see the Son of Man, see the right hand of power, all that stuff, whereas in the others it's more cryptic, because as you say, etc.
It means yes, it is as you say. But I think it's because you read in Christology into Mark that's not there.
But I'm saying,
and Matthew is simply reproducing it in his own words. I think you import rather than actually being in the text.
But I'm just saying, if we were seeing this consistent amplifying of Christology, we wouldn't expect them to actually lessen the Christology there by introducing some ambiguity, however much ambiguity.
I don't think it was there in the first bit. I think that is what it is in your mind rather than the text.
Okay, well,
to be honest,
we can let people determine that. I would say Mark. I do still think Matthew and Luke are advocating a high Christology there, but I think Mark at the least is clearer in that.
Can I give you another example?
And just carry on.
Okay, go on. Okay, go on.
Sorry, you speak a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
And if there was this consistent attempt to amplify Christology, we would have seen them leave it as it is in that case. But just generally the New Testament, does Matthew at places amplify Mark's Christology? I'm open to that. But then Luke, as we've discussed before, actually arguably has a lower Christology than Mark, and it depends how you interpret it. John, yes, has a high Christology, but as we were saying, Paul earlier on, has a very high Christology. So I feel like there are so many exceptions to this rule of a consistent amplification. Maybe we shouldn't talk at all about an amplification, but simply slightly different theologies and understanding of what's going on with Jesus.
I think we should talk about an evolution of Christology from lower to higher Christology. We see many, and not just Christology, but the way disciples are portrayed. I'll give you another example to do with Mary, the mother of Jesus. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 3, Mary is part of the outsiders. Mary and the family of Jesus are part of the outsiders who think Jesus is out of his mind, to quote the NRSV, or he's mad. You have a scene in Mark, the early Mark, where Jesus with the disciples indoors, and the family of Jesus are trying to get him because he's out of his mind. And someone asks, and Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters?" And Jesus says, "Whoever does the will of God is my mother and my brother and my father and my sister." Yeah. So, and his mother is outside, very symbolically, and she's trying to. She and the family. She's mentioned by name, trying to get in and sort out Jesus, who's clearly out of his mind. It's a very negative portrayal of the disciples and Mary. If you look at Luke's Gospel, which of course is a favourite of Catholics, Mary, that story doesn't exist. And Mary has become not just a model disciple, but the very first disciple of Jesus. She is the one that bears witness to who her son is. And this is why this Gospel is beloved by Catholics, because it has a very pure and high estimation of Mary. So what are we to do? What is history? What really happened? Was Mary an unbeliever? Or was she in fact a model disciple right from the beginning? Well, as Muslims we have an answer, because the Quran itself has a whole surah named after her, Miriam, and she is called an honourable woman. An honourable woman. She's not a disbeliever. She's not of those who don't believe. She believes. So we would affirm the truth of Luke over against Mark. But what's interesting is Luke uses Mark, and he corrects and edits Mark, clearly not believing Mark's the word of God. You don't edit and correct the word of God if you're a man, yeah? But Luke didn't believe Mark was the word of God because he disagrees with him on a whole range of things. So that's just one very specific example of how later Gospels elevate and correct an earlier Gospel, which is in the Bible, implying that it's wrong, actually.
So, a couple of points in response to that. Now, first of all, I do accept, is there a tidying within the Gospel? Yes, absolutely. So there are some difficult sayings in Mark, for example, whether about family, whether weird things about Jesus healing by spitting, blind man, all that stuff. And Matthew and Luke do tidy that up, absolutely. And so I'm not disputing that, but I would say there is a difference, obviously, between tidying and simply inventing something and bringing out
the story about Mary. You address specifically the point about Mary's story about Mary in Mark and Mary in Luke, because Luke uses Mary.
I'd have to look more into that.
Should we do it now?
Yeah.
Because this isn't just tidy. You see, I think what you're doing is an exercise in minimalising to an extreme, which is not tidying up. We're dealing with a fundamentally different view of the role and nature and belief of Mary. In Mark it's negative, in Luke it's very positive. There's nothing negative about Mary in Luke.
But with that,
which is historical, that's the question.
So there are cases where it's not tidying up, absolutely. This is the next point I was going to get to, which is fundamentally these are four Gospels with very different agendas. They have different motivations in being written. They're trying to bring out different things. Mark, for example, it's often said Mark is writing for Roman Christians suffering persecution, and therefore because of that he will consistently stress the failure of the disciples in order to encourage the Roman Christians that, you're frail, you're fallible, so too were Jesus' own disciples. Does that mean that when Matthew and Luke portray the disciples more positively that they're wrong? Well, no. It could be actually that they have a more well-rounded picture of the disciples, and that Mark is purposely bringing out the worst of them. Now, both actually historical, arguably, from my perspective, in that the individual sayings and actions they record of them are all accurate, but Mark will consistently focus on the negative, and the others will bring out the positives. The same could be true with the matter of Mary. It could be that, so what Luke records, you know, and the bit at the beginning, you know, blessed are you amongst women, or whatever said to her. Mark doesn't necessarily deny that. Well, first of all, he doesn't really have anything about Jesus until he suddenly appears at the age of 30 or whatever. So it's not actually entirely a fair comparison, because they've got very different material there. But I've lost my train of thought. But yes, they can be bringing out different aspects. Mark generally does not portray humans, and Mark generally does not portray well those you would expect, whether that be family, whether that be disciples, whether that be the Jewish people. Instead, it's the outcasts in society, it's the Gentiles, it's the demonic spirits, they're the ones who deceive. So I wouldn't say Mark is consciously contradicting Luke or vice versa. They've got very different things they're trying to portray. But I'm very happy to have a look at the text specifically.
I think the Gospels do disagree with each other, they correct each other, and I agree they're different audiences, but the question remains, behind the Gospels, what really happened?
Good question.
This is the question that is evaded by saying this tidying up kind of language you're using. Because it cannot be the case simultaneously that Mary was a disbeliever in her son and a model disciple of her son. Because one gospel portrays her as an unbeliever, and we'll look at it now, another one as a believer. History must record, the historical Jesus, the real Jesus of history, must show us one or the other. But we may not know the answer from the Bible, we don't really actually, but I believe from the Quran gives us the answer. That Mary actually, in fact, despite what Mark says and how he portrays her as a bad woman, she was a believer. She was an honourable woman. Now let's look at Mark chapter 3 and see what Mark says about Jesus. And I'm not saying this is historical, I'm simply saying this is what Mark says. Mark chapter 3 verses 20. And then the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard about it, they went out to restrain him. This is Jesus. For people were saying, he has gone out of his mind. And then if you jump to verse 31, because the rest of it's all about Jesus and Beelzebub, which is actually a Markan trope to do this. You might know this in your studies. Then his mother, this is Mary, and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. So they're part of the people who are calling Jesus to come out because he's out of his mind. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And Jesus replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at those seated around him, he says, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So clearly here we have the believers who are inside and those outside who are unbelievers. If we jump to Luke's Gospel...
Can we stick with that just quickly?
Oh yeah, sorry, come. Yeah.
Thanks, have a look at it.
Have a look.
Because I'm not sure,
It starts 3 onwards. So I've jumped from that verse to that verse.
Okay.
This is assuming quite a bit of scholarship here to understand why I've done that. I don't know if you've studied this, but you go ahead and...
I did at some point. If I remember all the scholarship, that's another matter. So in terms of when his family trying to restrain him, why is that? Is that they have no faith at all?
Is it out of his mind?
That he is who he said. Well, hold on a second. When his family heard... Then Jesus went home and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind.
So they believe he's out of his mind, they've gone to restrain him.
Either they're saying they believe he's out of his mind. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean he's been foolish in this situation? Does that mean he's an actual lunatic?
Yeah.
The fact that, for example, if my family heard that there were reports I was being a lunatic in Hyde Park, and they came to find me, does that mean they're agreeing I'm mad? No. It means people are saying I'm mad, something is going on.
It doesn't mean you're a believer.
Maybe I'm acting out.
Why don't you read the rest of it? Because read it in the whole chapter, because the context is clear that she is not a believer. If you read here, because this helps you to understand she's not a believer, that's why.
Okay, I will, if I could interpret this bit, and then that bit, and then together.
No, just do it together and then interpret it. If you do this bit by bit, you're not going to get the right...
Well, any time you do an interpretation, there comes a point where you've got to focus on individual sentences.
In the light after you've read it, you haven't read it all.
Well, you read it out for us.
Well, then, you see, this could be interpreted in light of that. She is not part of the believing group.
My overall interpretation, which I'm happy to give of all of these passages, though I wanted to explain bit by bit first how I come there, but my overall interpretation is It's possible that Mary, Jesus' mother Mary, at this point, is not believing in him. She's having a crisis of faith, she's doubting. I'm very open to that.
Shall we look at that passage?
But it's also, well, you want to know overall interpretation, and you did bring out the
No, but to read it, to read it
fine.
out.
Okay.
Because it's really important.
Okay. Then he went home and the crowd came. I'm going to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Then he went out. They went home and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him. For people were saying he has gone out of his mind.
Yeah.
So to skip forward, as you did earlier, then his mothers and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." How to interpret this text?
Exactly.
Either you could be correct, they are not believing in him, in which I can say Mary's having a crisis of faith. Not surprising, almost all religious people do at some point in their life. If you don't have one, maybe actually you're not thinking hard enough. So that doesn't necessarily need to contradict this, what's said about Luke, said in Luke's Gospel about Mary, many years earlier, maybe 30 years earlier or so. Very different circumstances. People change in their levels of religious faith. I know I do. Probably almost everyone watching this does. To interpret this, another interpretation would be she still believes that her son is special, is the Messiah, that God's chosen one, but they're saying that he's mad. She doesn't say that she agrees that he's mad, but the family, having heard that people were saying he's got out of mind, went out to restrain him. If I was here at Speaker's Corner and people said I was out of my mind and my parents heard, my parents would say something's going on. Maybe he's gone mad. Maybe he's acting strange when people are interpreting as being mad. Maybe it's unfair slander and people are out to get
You're
him.
not the Messiah.
Who knows?
You're not the Messiah who was born of a virgin.
No, fine, but there are all sorts of circumstances. Fine, Jesus, the parents, fine. Jesus' family could have thought he's actually gone mad. People are unfairly accusing him of being mad and we have to go defend him and get him out of that dangerous situation. Or he's been completely normal and his enemies, who are frequent in Mark's Gospel, are out to get him. All sorts of options on how to interpret that text.
I think a very common scholarly way of looking at it is you see the outsiders, then his mother and his brothers came standing outside. These words are quite significant. They're not just random descriptors. And they called out to him, calling him to come out. And then Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him inside, said, "Here is my mother. Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." That's really quite rude about a Jewish mother, because his mother's outside saying, "Where are you, my son?" He's saying, in fact, "You're not my mother. This is my mother. Whoever does the will of God is my mother, my brother, and my sister." This is really dividing families in the way he said he would. He come to divide, mothers and daughters-in-laws and fathers-in-law and all that stuff. So, and this negative portrayal as Mary, as implied as an unbeliever, is followed through with the disciples in general in Mark. When we come to Luke.
Could I just say one more thing about that? This actually reminds me of Peter. Peter makes the confession of faith. I think it's Mark chapter 8, Caesarea Philippi. He says, you are the Christ, and then immediately after, Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." So
In
Mark's Gospel, yeah,
but not in Matthew.
Fine, we're talking about Mark.
Okay.
That's another issue, but we're talking about Mark. In Mark's Gospel, Peter goes from being the disciple who speaks up, "You're the Christ," immediately after, "Get behind me, Satan." Why? Peter is standing in the way of Jesus' mission. And when you do that, Jesus was very stern against Peter. Likewise, in this scenario, for whatever reason, whether they think he's mad, whether they're just trying to protect him, whether they think his enemies are just out to get him, in this situation, his family are trying to take him away from a crowd of people listening. And therefore, in this circumstance, what he sounds like he's saying is, family relations do not come above listening to the gospel, to the word of God. It doesn't. I don't see anything in that text which means to say that. So when Peter was called Satan, was Peter not a follower of Jesus? No, he was a follower of Jesus. He believed in Jesus. But Jesus is very strongly saying, "You are getting in the way of my mission." Likewise here, Jesus is not going to let his family get before preaching the word.
I think bringing in other stories is just confusing the matter. But as you mentioned, Peter, I'll mention it. Yes, in Mark, as you say, he is portrayed very negatively. But as we know, the later Gospels, they spruce up and elevate and change the original story. So what do we find in Matthew? exactly the same story. And Matthew uses Mark, so Matthew is correcting and adding to Mark. No longer is it a negative portrayal in Matthew. In Matthew, Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock," it's a pun in Aramaic, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail it." And he also says, by the way, in Mark, where Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, Matthew adds words on. He says, he has Peter say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Wow. And God says, "Blessed are you." So we have now a confession of faith, which, as I said before many times, is absolutely characteristic of Matthew's treatment of the disciples when he is correcting and revising Mark's negative portrayal. So your example actually enhances my point. So in Mark we have a negative portrayal of Mary as an outsider. The family of Jesus are outsiders. In Luke, let's see how Luke treats...
Can I respond to that before we move on?
Well, not really, because you keep on trying to get to Luke.
Well, no, but before you got to Luke, you decided to go down a different route about Matthew and
No, but you did, because you brought it up. You mentioned Peter, so I had then to respond to...
I brought up Peter and Mark's Gospel. You then went on a different Matthew. You gave another example.
Then I had to respond to that. If you're going to cite Matthew and Mark, I'm going to cite... If you're going to cite Peter and Mark, I'm going to cite Matthew and Mark, who... Similarly, with Mary and Peter, they're both given a very much enhanced status in Matthew.
And so coming to respond to that, but my point was simply...
Well, come to Luke here.
But my point was, I do feel that actually I was using Mark to interpret Mark. Within Mark, Jesus very clearly can make a strong statement calling Peter Satan, even though he's still a disciple. Likewise, Jesus can, in that occasion, in the same Gospel, Mark, speak to some extent disparagingly about his family without necessarily implying they're not believers. It was relevant, it was on point. Your point did have relevant, but it was a kind of, I would say, secondary relevance.
Well, I would say it was primary relevance. Okay, can I continue now?
Yes.
So I think I've demonstrated from multiple passages that later Gospels like Matthew and Luke correct, edit and improve the presentation of the disciples, the presentation of Jesus. As historians, if I wasn't a historian, obviously I'm not a historian, but historians ask what really happened. How can we go behind the embellishments and the elaborations and the stories of the Gospels to the actual real historical Jesus? And that's why New Testament studies exist, because if you compare and contrast the same story in different places, you'll realise there's something going on here more than just history. We're dealing with elaboration, embellishment, invention, making stories up, particularly in Matthew's Gospel. Now coming back to Luke here, so we've got a negative portrayal of Jesus, of disciples in Mark. In Luke's Gospel, Mary sings the Magnificat.
A very quick question.
Sorry, yeah.
Who's going to go? What degree is it you're studying at Oxford?
I finished studying.
Oh, sorry, what was it?
Do I want to say in camera? Why not? I did a undergrad in theology, BA, and I did an MPhil in Judaism and Christianity, the Greco-Roman world.
Okay, I'm looking to go.
Okay, they're very good. I highly recommend them.
Yeah, okay.
Much better than Cambridge. Yeah. Don't become a tap.
No, Cambridge is much better. Tim Winter, I recommend Cambridge Divinity Faculty. Much better. Huh?
Fifi Alakiti. We're going for Islamic studies.
No. It's anyway, go on. So in John's... sorry, can I continue?
Yes,
thank you.
Questions, have a chat.
I love you're showing your belly there. It's good, sir. Anyway, and in Luke's Gospel we have a nativity narrative, which is a story about Jesus' birth and Mary and so on, angels and whatnot, shepherds. And we have the Magnificat, as it's called in classical language. This is Mary's song of praise, where she thanks God for giving giving Israel a saviour and so on. And all the way through Luke, as Catholics will always testify, Mary is a model disciple. There's not a whiff that she is an unbeliever in Luke. And remember, Luke uses Mark. So Luke is aware of the way that Mary is portrayed in a very negative way. If that was history, why didn't he simply incorporate that in his gospel? This is because he has a different purpose, a different audience, a different intention. He wants to present Mary and the family of Jesus a bit like, I was going to say Shias do with the family of Muhammad, with version of the son with Fatima and so on, the Holy Family. So the problem is about history. What really happened? And this is the problem we have. Is Mark more accurate, Mary disbeliever, or is Luke more accurate, Mary believer? And I don't think we can answer that question historically unless we have the Quran as Muslims, which do gives Mary that status, an honourable woman, as a faithful daughter of Jesus and a worshipper of God, and a whole chapter of the surah is named after her. But Christians have this problem that what do you do with the Bible which says different things about the same people? Completely opposite things.
Yeah.
This is the problem you have.
So I take...
Well, give it to him. He's got...
Whatever you prefer, I don't mind.
Either nipple, I don't know.
Cool, thank you. So I partly agree with Paul and I partly disagree with Paul. Where I disagree is when they say completely different things. So, I do think that Mark portrays Mary more negatively than Luke. Absolutely. I've tried to explain, no, that I don't think it presents her as a complete unbeliever, or at least it doesn't need to in the scenario you gave. I also mentioned earlier that a part of the difference is the Magnificat occurs in a time period that Mark's Gospel simply doesn't cover. Mark hasn't chosen to omit that particular thing. He's chosen not to mention the childhood or pre-birth of Christ. So there's no opportunity for Mark even to mention that, even if he chose to do so. So I don't think that well, he could have chosen, he's not omitting that for the sake of his view on Mary. He's omitting the pre-birth narrative for some reason that we could dispute.
The entire life of Mary in Luke's Gospel, she is portrayed as a positive role model. Okay. He knows how Mark talks about it, and he chooses to omit or delete that story because it doesn't accord with his view of Mary.
That's fine. They do have different views of Mary. I accept that. I'm just saying that the Magnificat specifically,
which is history.
Mark, okay, just
what really happened?
To summarise, because it was just a challenge, the Magnificat specifically, the way Mark has structured his Gospel, there is not a place that he would put that in. Now, in terms of which is history, this is a really good question. I take quite a conservative view of the Synoptic Gospels, such that I think they record what was actually said and what was actually done. But how do you accord for the differences amongst them? As I've been saying, I do think they're different perspectives, different theologies. They bring out different elements, but I don't think they're diametrically opposed to one another. If I'm talking about my friend John, if I'm trying to stress the sinfulness of man, I can point out all the flaws, all the weaknesses, all the failings of John. If I'm trying to point out in my narrative the beauty of Christian friendship, for example, a very different purpose, I will highlight all the good ways that he's been a blessing in my life. Likewise with Mary. As mentioned earlier, Mark has an overall narrative which is stressing the lack of faith and the weakness of those from whom we most expect it. So, I would say I take a historical view of what's going on, but yes, I do think when we're approaching the Gospels, and actually Paul would agree with me here, they're not pure simple histories. They're not just trying to say what happened, though I do think at least the synoptics are trying to do that. They are crafting a narrative to make a point. That's why they are very selective about what they include, and therefore you will come away with very different impressions based upon that agenda. Did I answer your question?
Not really. I disagree with everything you said. So,
you want me to disagree? Did I try and answer your question, or did I miss your question?
No, I think the Magnificat issue is, I think you misunderstood my point, which is that from the beginning of Luke's Gospel, from Magnificat onwards, you have a very beautiful portrayal of Mary in Luke as a believer. It's irrelevant that Mark doesn't have a Magnificat. I'm saying that from the beginning of his story, Mary is a disbeliever. And I was just pointing out, I was doing redaction criticism, observing what was going on. So I think they are fundamentally incompatible portraits, and we don't know on the basis of the Bible, which is true. We have to go outside of that if we can. But the broader picture is that Mark has fashioned his material to present an overwhelmingly negative view of the disciples. The later Gospels correct and embellish their own stories to present a much more positive view of the disciples. As historians ask what really happened. They had to choose between or go to a third option about what happened. And that's the problem. But we also see this. We also see the problem here, the status of Jesus, where Jesus in the earliest Gospel does not walk around saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was, I am." He is not presented as a pre-existent divine son, whereas in John he is. And scholars overwhelmingly have had to choose in history which Gospel is more likely to be the historical Jesus, either Mark or John, to give the two ends of the spectrum. And 99% of scholars in history, for the last 100 years, at Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, you know, they've chosen Mark over John. And John is a later, highly interpreted account where words are put in the mouth of Jesus. To use Richard Baucom's language, as your own scholar here, he uses this language of John putting in the words of John putting in the mouth of Jesus words like "I am." And if you read his book, The Crucified God, by Richard Baucom, a lesser-known text, he constantly talks about where he uses Isaiah language and puts it on the lips of Jesus. And I agree with him, he does. So even the most conservative Christian scholars acknowledge that gospel writers make stuff up, put it on the mouths and the lips of Jesus, and then average Christians out there believe that Jesus actually said these words historically. But your own scholars freely acknowledge, even the Richard Baucom, that this is not true. And it's this big gulf between what your scholars know and teach and what the people in the pew are not told. I don't imagine your church, I don't know your church, but what's the likelihood in your church you're being told what I've just said about your own scholars, about Richard Baucom?
Yeah, pretty low.
Is it zero, perhaps?
To my knowledge, they've never said what you just said.
Exactly.
And I'm on your side on this.
And this is the scandal. Because there's sex scandal in Catholicism, this is the intellectual sin scandal of Christianity, is that the priests and the pastors and ministers who get trained by these scholars at university, they do not pass on this information to the people in the pew. The people in the pew are not stupid. For example, this chap here, who I know, he has a PhD in mathematics. He actually does. I'm not making this up. But he is a typical guy in the pew who will not hear in his own church what I'm telling you, because the pastors and ministers do not teach highly intelligent people like this gentleman here, who could understand, because they got an IQ probably higher than the minister, if they were just told. The question is, why do not priests, ministers and pastors pass this information on?
They're not there to pass on that sort of information. A part of it, my primary purpose of the sermon is as a pastoral. It's pastoral in order to teach how to live your life.
You may be right.
And it's to learn theologically about Christ. The average person in the pews is not after the
This is an average person in the pew with a PhD in mathematics. No, he's not stupid. I'm not being patronised. You're both bright people. You deserve to be told.
I've known this guy for a long time. I understand he's not being patronising.
Trying not to be patronising. But my point is this, that I think you deserve, as a Christian, to be told the truth about the Bible. Your own pastors and preachers know from the Richard Baucoms and the Tom Wrights, the leading biblical scholars of the world, they do not pass this on, and that is a scandal, in my view.
Okay, even that view that these words are made up and not put in, and they didn't actually come out of the mouth of Jesus.
Yes.
I still expect there's a spectrum amongst scholars, exactly what is true with respect to that point.
I'm quoting the most conservative Christian scholars that he recommends, and they say it too. I'm not quoting liberals or radicals.
They say there's a creative element.
There's a spectrum within that belief. My point was there's a spectrum within that belief. And which point on that spectrum are they meant to teach?
They teach any of it, but they don't teach any of it. They don't attempt. Well, I take your point about sermons perhaps not being the right place, but at least perhaps a minister could say, right, I'm going to hold a Bible class on a Wednesday evening to teach the truth to teach you what our own biblical scholars are saying about the Bible the last 100 years. What are the scholars saying about the Gospel of John? Is John's Jesus historical? Is he actually saying what the historical Jesus said?
As long as there are some scholars who are saying, thank you. As long as there are some scholars who are saying it is historical, then presumably pastors might choose to prefer those ones and go with that narrative. So
you name me one who does.
So I'm trying. It's a while since I've read it, but a lot of work has been done on the historical reliability of John by, I think it's either Craig Blomberg or another kind of quite well-known, respected evangelical scholar. Basically, thinking. Acknowledging there are kind of prima facie some differences between them, but trying to account for that in many different ways. So I presume pastors might have read those works.
I have, yes.
I presume pastors might have read those works and found them convincing.
I think the problem with Craig Blomberg is, people don't know who he is. Craig Blomberg is a New Testament scholar in the United States who teaches New Testament studies at Denver Seminary. To be on the faculty of Denver Seminary in the United States, you can go on their website, Google it, Denver Seminary. They have to swear and sign a document every year that they will teach about the Bible. That is the holy, literal truth, the historical, factual truth of God. And if they don't sign that, they don't get a job. They lose their tenure. So even though Craig Blomberg is actually a real scholar, and I have some of his books on John, and I respect him, he is constrained within a very narrow theological parameter that he must say at the end of the day that John is factual, John is true, John, because if he doesn't, he will lose his job. And that is one hell of a motivation for someone to say, his scholarship, unfortunately, in my view, operates within those parameters. And if you had a gun to your head saying, and you had a mortgage and kids, unless you say the right thing about the Bible, you will lose your job. What are the chances of you doing the right thing?
It depends how much personal integrity we think that Craig Blomberg has. I'll leave that to Craig Blomberg.
But this is a really important point. So coming back to him, he has what he does is his methodology is what I call maximally conservative. So he'll look at all the critical options about the historicity of the saying of Jesus in John. He will look at all the options available, and then he will choose infallibly, always, without exception, the most conservative view available, and then he will incorporate that. So you have a patchwork of scholarly views, but they're all the maximally conservative. Now, I would question that methodology.
But which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is he at Denver Theological Seminary because he is very conservative, sincerely believes that, thinks that's the best intellectual case, therefore ends up at a seminary where he has to believe that? Or does he have to believe that, and that means he's always wedded to that?
Both and.
Is there a pressure on him to always be conservative? Yes. Does that override his intellectual integrity? I don't know.
His methodology is one of maximal conservatism. Is that a scholarly critical methodology? To always choose the most conservative view?
If you believe that that's where the evidence leads, then yes. I don't know what's going on in his mind.
Why has he got this methodology? Because, partly because his seminary requires him to have that view, and it does require him.
But what I'm saying is, he had that methodology, and that's why he went to that seminary.
So this is why, or both, I think. This is why.
Who knows what's going on in the mind of Craig Blomberg?
No, but we do know what's going on in terms of the organisational constraints and what he's permitted to publish as a Denver Seminary scholar, and those are very narrowly defined.
We don't know whether that has ever stopped him from coming to a different conclusion, or if he has intellectually always agreed with Denver Theological Seminary, which is quite possible if that's his epistemology, that's his methodology. I'm saying we just don't know, so you're right.
I think it's very questionable. So I think we need to look at other scholars who are not constrained by their employer to produce certain kinds of work.
There is another option open to him.
Oh yes.
Which is for a particular verse, if he disagrees with the maximal conservative view, he could just not talk about that verse and go on to talk about another verse.
I agree. But he doesn't. He always chooses the most conservative
We don't know
option.
that. We don't know if he's not.
No, I do, because you can see it in the book. If you go through all the arguments, I can predict on any given discussion, he will always pick the most conservative view.
No, but you don't know that he hasn't considered other verses for discussion in that book and then left them out because he doesn't agree.
I've got a train to catch.
Have you?
I do actually. I've got a family dinner.
Okay, have a lovely time. Sorry. Lovely, as always. And have a nice family dinner.
يا لغتي عربية حسبي بأنك منطقي وبياني عربية قلبي